On March 9, 1994, at 11:47 p.m., Yoav Gallant stood in a cramped safe house in Buenos Aires, staring at 7 passport photographs spread across a folding table. All Israeli nationals, all missing, all taken within the last 72 hours. The intelligence said they were being held at a warehouse in Quilmes. The same intelligence said they would be executed before sunrise on March 11th. That gave Gallant's team roughly 36 hours. What the intelligence didn't say was whether any of it was true. Gallant had been running counter-terror operations in South America for 8 years. He knew how Hezbollah moved in the region. He knew their recruitment patterns, their logistics networks, their preferred methods of communication. What he didn't know was why they would kidnap 7 random Israeli tourists with no obvious strategic value. The intelligence had come from a single source, a low-level courier who had never provided location data before. His previous value was in message traffic, not operational detail. Gallant had flagged this in his brief to Tel Aviv. The response was to proceed anyway. The alternative was to wait for better information while 7 people ran out of time. Gallant's team consisted of 8 operatives. 3 were surveillance specialists. 2 were combat-trained extractors. 1 was a signals intelligence officer. 1 was a trauma medic. And 1 was a negotiator named Shira Eban. Eban's inclusion told Gallant something important. Someone in Tel Aviv wasn't confident this was a rescue operation. They thought it might be a negotiation or a recovery. She asked him 2 questions during the initial briefing. First, did they have confirmation the hostages were alive? No. Second, had the execution deadline been corroborated by a second source? Also, no. Gallant told her they were acting on the best available information. She told him the best available information was incomplete. He said waiting for completeness wasn't an option. On March 10th, the team began surveillance of the Quilmes site. It was a 3-building industrial complex, registered to a textile import company that hadn't filed tax returns in 2 years. The perimeter was fenced but not actively guarded. Thermal imaging showed between 4 and 6 individuals inside the main building, but no movement patterns that suggested restrained hostages. Gallant made his first critical decision. They wouldn't wait for full pattern of life confirmation. If the execution timeline was real, 48 hours of surveillance meant acting too late. At 6:15 p.m., a panel van arrived. 2 men exited, entered the building carrying supply containers, and left 11 minutes later. Gallant interpreted it as logistical preparation, potentially for disposal after an execution. Eben saw it differently. She suggested the containers could mean the hostages weren't at the site yet, that they were being staged for a centralized event. If that was true, hitting the warehouse early would scatter the captors and make the hostages harder to find. Gallant overruled her. His assessment was that waiting increased risk more than it reduced uncertainty. At 11:20 p.m., the team moved to breach. The entry plan assumed a hydraulic loading bay door. When they reached it, they discovered it was manual with an internal drop bar. The hydraulic spreader couldn't generate enough force without excessive noise. They switched to a thermal lance, a cutting tool that burns through steel using oxygen-fed metal rods. It worked, but it took 4 minutes instead of 90 seconds. By the time they entered the building, anyone inside had heard them coming. The main floor was empty. No hostages, no captors, just textile machinery and abandoned shipping crates. Gallant's immediate thought was that they'd breached the wrong building within the complex. Then, one of the surveillance specialists found the stairwell leading down. The basement wasn't on any architectural records. It was roughly 200 square meters, divided into 3 rooms. The first contained a desk, a shortwave radio, and scattered documents in Arabic and Spanish. The second had sleeping mats and personal effects evidence that multiple people had staged there over days or weeks. The third room had 7 chairs. 4 were overturned. 2 showed plastic zip tie residue on the armrests. But no hostages, no captors, no indication of where they'd gone. Gallant radioed the perimeter team. Had any vehicles exited in the last 10 minutes? No, which meant either the hostages had never been there or they'd been moved hours before the team arrived. Eban examined the documents in the first room. Most were logistical supply orders, vehicle rentals, but one was handwritten in Arabic. She translated aloud, "Transfer complete. Proceed to secondary. Confirm by 22 Sao." It was 11:31 p.m. The note was 3.5 hours old. The signals officer reported encrypted radio traffic on a known Hezbollah frequency within the last hour. He couldn't break it without more time. Gallant stared at the overturned chairs. One of them had blood on the leg, not enough to suggest a killing, but enough to indicate violence. Someone asked the obvious question. If the hostages had been moved hours ago, where did that leave the execution timeline? Gallant didn't answer. He was deciding whether to extract the team and report failure, or assume the operation was still live and commit to an uncertain pursuit. If he was wrong, he'd waste critical hours chasing ghosts. If he was right and did nothing, 7 people would die while his team stood in an empty room. He made the call to continue, but he didn't tell Tel Aviv the warehouse was empty. The documents recovered from the warehouse included a rental agreement for a property in Lomas de Zamora, a district 12 kilometers west. The agreement was dated March 8th, the same day the first hostage disappeared. Eban argued this was the more likely holding site. Gallant agreed, but with a critical gap. They had no floor plan, no surveillance data, and no confirmation anyone was actually there. The signals officer flagged an intercepted radio transmission at 11:52 p.m., brief in Arabic. The phrase "the western site" was mentioned once. That was all Gallant needed. He ordered the team to move. They reached Lomas de Zamora at 12:40 a.m. The property was a 2-story residential building set back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. Lights were on in 2 upstairs windows. A white Ford pickup sat in the driveway consistent with vehicle descriptions from one of the abduction reports. Thermal imaging showed at least 9 heat signatures inside. Gallant's initial assessment: 7 hostages, 2 captors. But the signatures weren't moving. They were clustered in a single ground floor room. That didn't match a holding pattern, it matched the staging. Eban said it aloud first. If the hostages were positioned in one room with captors standing over them, a loud breach would likely trigger an immediate execution. She recommended attempting contact first, using a loudspeaker to establish communication and buy time for a quieter entry. Gallant rejected it. His read was that any delay increased the chance they'd arrived too late. If everyone was in one room, they were accessible in a single entry. Speed would save them. Hesitation would kill them. But one of the extraction specialists disagreed. He pointed out that they had no intelligence on how many captors were actually inside. 9 heat signatures could mean 2 hostages were already dead and 7 captors were waiting. Or it could mean 3 captors and 6 hostages. The thermal data couldn't distinguish. Gallant asked him what he recommended. The operative said, "We abort. Get real surveillance. Come back in 6 hours with actual information." Eban agreed. She said the blood on the chair in the warehouse could mean they'd already lost someone. Rushing a second breach based on another assumption could mean losing everyone. Gallant stood outside the building for 40 seconds without speaking. His team was splitting. Half wanted to abort, half wanted to move. The intelligence had been wrong once. It could be wrong again, but if it wasn't, if 7 people were inside that building waiting for a bullet, then walking away meant living with a decision he couldn't reverse. He gave the order to breach. At 1:03 a.m., the team hit the front door with a battering ram. The frame splintered in one strike. They entered in tactical formation, weapons raised, prepared for immediate resistance. They found 7 people sitting on the floor, hands bound behind their backs, black hoods over their heads, 2 men standing behind them, arms at their sides. But the men weren't holding weapons to anyone's head. They were just standing there. The 2 captors raised their hands immediately. No defensive posture, no attempt to reach for sidearms. One of them said, in broken English, "We were told you would come." Gallant ordered them restrained and searched. They were carrying handguns in hip holsters, but neither had drawn. On the floor beside one of the hostages was a video camera on a tripod, pointed directly at the group. The camera was off, but the battery was fully charged. The record light had tape over it. Eban removed the hoods from the hostages one by one. All 7 were conscious, disoriented but physically unharmed. No visible signs of beating, no evidence of interrogation. When she asked how long they'd been in that room, one of them said, "Maybe 2 hours. They moved us here from somewhere else." Gallant asked the captors when the execution was scheduled. One of them looked genuinely confused. He responded in Spanish, "There was no execution. We were hired to hold them until someone arrived." Gallant separated the 2 captors and interrogated them individually. Their stories matched. Both were Argentine nationals. Neither had direct Hezbollah affiliation. They'd been contracted through an intermediary to secure and transport 7 individuals to this location and wait for further instructions. They were paid $3,000 each in U.S. currency. They didn't know who the hostages were or why they'd been taken. When pressed on who gave the orders, one of them provided a phone number and a first name: Hassan. The number was traced within 30 minutes. It belonged to a prepaid mobile phone registered in Brazil. The phone had been used exactly twice in the last 72 hours. Once to coordinate the rental agreement, once to send a text message to a Beirut-based number. The text read, "Package delivered. Ready for collection." Mossad's signals division identified the Beirut number immediately. It belonged to Fadi Majed, a mid-level Hezbollah logistics coordinator. But Majed wasn't an operational planner. His role was administrative, resource allocation, budgeting, personnel scheduling. He wasn't the kind of operative who planned hostage executions. Eban asked Gallant to consider a different interpretation of the evidence. 7 Israelis taken over 72 hours, held at 2 separate locations, moved deliberately but not covertly. No interrogation, no ransom demand, no public statement, and captors who seemed to be waiting for something rather than preparing for something. She said, "What if this wasn't an execution? What if it was bait?" Gallant asked what she meant. Eban laid it out. If Hezbollah wanted to understand how Mossad responds to hostage scenarios on Argentine soil, the most effective method would be to create one. Leak credible intelligence. Establish a tight timeline, force a rapid operational response, then observe. Team composition, vehicle types, entry tactics, response protocols, decision-making under pressure. All of it documented in real time. Gallant said, "Why burn resources on surveillance when you can just kill 7 Israelis and claim it as a victory?" Eban replied, "Because dead hostages give you 1 news cycle. A failed rescue gives you operational intelligence you can use for years. And a successful rescue gives you even more because you get to watch how they operate when they think they've won." Then the signals officer interrupted. He'd just intercepted another encrypted transmission on the same Hezbollah frequency they'd been monitoring. The signal strength suggested it had originated within a 3-kilometer radius of their current location. Someone was watching them, right now. Gallant made an immediate decision: evacuate. No secondary sweep of the building. No attempt to locate the nearby transmitter. If this was a surveillance operation, every additional minute on site was feeding intelligence to the other side. The team extracted all personnel and hostages by 1:47 a.m. They reached the Buenos Aires safe house at 2:35 a.m. All 7 hostages were alive. The mission, by any tactical measure, had succeeded. But as Gallant sat in the safe house reviewing the night's events, one detail kept circling back. The video camera, fully charged, pointed at the hostages, tape over the record light. If it had been set up to film an execution, why wasn't it recording when they arrived? Unless it wasn't meant to film the hostages at all. At 3:15 a.m., Gallant debriefed each of the 7 hostages individually. Their accounts were consistent on the basic facts. Abducted by force at different times and locations, transported separately in panel vans, held in isolation for 12 to 36 hours, then moved together to the final location approximately 3 hours before the rescue. But one hostage, a 34-year-old engineer from Haifa named David Mizrahi, mentioned something no one else had noticed. While being transported in the van, he'd been seated near the front. The captors were speaking to each other in Arabic. He didn't understand most of it, but his grandfather had been Moroccan, and he recognized one phrase, al-Istidad al-Qas. Iban translated it immediately, special preparation. It was Hezbollah operational shorthand. She'd heard it twice before in intercepts. Both times it referred to surveillance exercises. Gallant asked Mizrahi if he was certain about the phrase. Mizrahi said yes, he'd repeated it silently to himself multiple times to make sure he remembered it correctly. At 4:12 a.m., Gallant sent an encrypted report to Tel Aviv. He confirmed all 7 hostages were safe. He also flagged the surveillance theory and recommended the team remain in Buenos Aires to assess operational exposure. The response came back 28 minutes later. Leadership acknowledged the successful extraction but expressed concern about the intelligence gaps. They authorized a 72-hour assessment period. During that window, the team was to conduct counter-surveillance sweeps and determine whether their operational profile had been compromised. Gallant assigned 2 surveillance specialists to begin monitoring Israeli-linked sites across Buenos Aires synagogues, the embassy district, community centers. If Hezbollah had been observing the rescue, they'd likely maintain observation on related targets. Iban told him she thought he was underestimating the scope. She said if this had been designed as a surveillance operation, Hezbollah wouldn't just watch the rescue itself. They'd watch the aftermath. How the team moved post-operation, where they staged, how they communicated with Tel Aviv, whether they changed protocols after realizing they'd been observed. Gallant asked her what she recommended. She said, "Assume everything we did tonight was recorded. Assume they know our faces, our vehicles, our entry methods, and assume they're still watching." He asked if she thought they should extract immediately, get the hostages out of Argentina within 24 hours and dissolve the team. She said yes, but she also said it might already be too late. On March 11th at 9:30 a.m., one of the surveillance specialists reported activity at the AMIA building, the Jewish Community Center in central Buenos Aires. A man, matching the description of a known Hezbollah affiliate, had been observed conducting what appeared to be a photographic survey of the building's perimeter. He'd spent 11 minutes walking the block, stopping at 3 different angles, holding a camera but not obviously taking pictures. Gallant ordered the operative to maintain distant observation but not to engage. If this was part of the surveillance network, confronting him would only confirm that Mossad knew they were being watched. At 11:05 a.m., a second sighting. Different individual, same behavior. This time outside a synagogue in the Belgrano district. The man spent 8 minutes examining entry points and sight lines. Gallant called an emergency team meeting. He told them the working theory was no longer theoretical, it was confirmed. Hezbollah had used the hostage scenario to draw out an operational response, and they were now conducting follow-up, reconnaissance on Jewish targets across the city. One of the extraction specialists asked the obvious question: should they engage? If Hezbollah was actively surveilling sites, that meant they were planning something. Observing without acting meant allowing preparation for a future attack. Gallant faced the same decision structure he'd faced 12 hours earlier. Act on incomplete information, or wait for clarity that might come too late. Eben argued for immediate engagement. She said if they had the visual confirmation of Hezbollah operatives conducting site surveys, that was enough. Detain them, interrogate them, break the operational chain before it progressed. But Gallant hesitated. If they detained the operatives, Hezbollah would know their surveillance had been detected. That would burn whatever residual intelligence value remained in the operation. It would also confirm that Mossad had a functional presence in Buenos Aires, something that, up until the previous night, may not have been certain. He decided to continue observation without engagement. He told the team they would document the surveillance activity, identify as many operatives as possible, and pass the intelligence to Argentine authorities for action. Eben asked him if he trusted Argentine authorities to act on it. He didn't answer. At 2:40 p.m., the signals officer reported another intercepted transmission. This one was longer, nearly 90 seconds, still encrypted, but the traffic pattern suggested coordination between multiple parties. The transmission originated from somewhere in central Buenos Aires. It was followed, 6 minutes later, by a response transmission from a location approximately 18 kilometers south. Gallant asked if there was any way to decrypt it. The signals officer said not without bringing in additional resources from Tel Aviv, which would take at least 48 hours. By 6 p.m. on March 11th, the surveillance team had identified 3 separate individuals conducting reconnaissance at 4 different Jewish sites across Buenos Aires. All 3 matched known profiles in Mossad's Hezbollah database. None of them appeared to be communicating with each other directly, which suggested compartmentalized tasking. Gallant updated Tel Aviv with the findings. The response was unambiguous: do not engage, document and monitor only. The Israeli government did not want a confrontation on Argentine soil that could escalate into a diplomatic incident. On March 12th, the reconnaissance activity stopped. No further sightings, no additional transmissions. The 3 identified operatives vanished from observable patterns. Gallant interpreted this as a positive sign. He believed the surveillance phase had concluded and Hezbollah had moved to operational planning elsewhere, likely outside Argentina. Eban disagreed. She said the sudden cessation of visible activity didn't mean the operation had ended. It meant it had moved to a phase where visibility was no longer necessary. She told Gallant that everything Hezbollah needed to know, they now knew. On March 13th, Gallant received authorization to extract the team. All 7 hostages were relocated to safe transit points and returned to Israel over the following 48 hours. The operation was classified as a tactical success. Internal reviews noted the intelligence failures but praised the decision-making under uncertainty. Gallant filed his final report on March 16th. In it, he acknowledged the surveillance theory, but stated that without direct evidence of compromised protocols, he couldn't conclusively determine operational exposure. 4 months later, the evidence arrived. On July 18, 1994, 4 months and 5 days after Operation Barum Night, a Renault traffic van packed with approximately 275 kilograms of ammonium nitrate explosives detonated outside the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. The blast occurred at 9:53 a.m. during morning activities. 85 people were killed. More than 300 were injured. The 7-story building partially collapsed. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentine history. Argentine intelligence spent 2 years investigating the bombing. In 1996, a sealed report was shared with Israeli officials. The report concluded that while Hezbollah had been planning an attack on Jewish targets in Buenos Aires since late 1993, the tactical execution timing, target selection, entry route analysis, and security gap exploitation showed evidence of updated intelligence gathered in early 1994. Specifically, the attackers had known 3 things that weren't publicly available. The AMI building's perimeter security operated on a rotating schedule with a 7-minute gap during shift changes. Israeli security personnel in Buenos Aires prioritized embassy sites over community centers, and Mossad's emergency response protocol involved delayed perimeter sweeps to avoid the compromising surveillance positions. All 3 of those operational details had been observable during the march. Hostage rescue. Mossad's internal review began in August 1994. The inquiry was led by a senior operations officer who had not been involved in Barum Night. He interviewed all 8 team members individually. He reviewed every decision point, every communication with Tel Aviv, every intercept, every surveillance log. His conclusion, delivered in a classified brief in November 1994, was direct. The March operation had provided Hezbollah with a real-time case study in Israeli counter-terror response. The hostage scenario had been designed not to kill 7 people, but to force an operational exposure that could be analyzed and exploited. The review noted that Gallant's decision to proceed despite incomplete intelligence was tactically sound. The hostages were real. The threat was credible. Waiting for perfect information would have meant waiting too long, but the review also noted that the decision to continue surveillance after the rescue rather than immediately extracting had extended the observation window. Every hour the team remained in Buenos Aires after March 10th was an hour Hezbollah could study how Mossad operated in a post-crisis environment. Gallant was not reprimanded. He was reassigned. He continued running operations in South America until 1998, but no longer in counter-terror. His role shifted to economic intelligence, monitoring financial networks, tracking money flows, liaison work with banking regulators. In a closed-door testimony in 1999, he was asked whether he would have acted differently if he'd known the rescue was being observed. His answer was no. He said the hostages were real. The threat was credible. The alternative was to let 7 people die while waiting for certainty that would never come. He was then asked if he believed the AMIA bombing could have been prevented. He said he didn't know. But he acknowledged that the intelligence Hezbollah gained in March made the July attack easier to execute. Eban left field operations in late 1994. She transitioned to analysis and training, working primarily out of Tel Aviv. In 2003, she gave one of the only interviews she ever granted to an Israeli defense journal, on condition of anonymity. She was asked what the hardest part of intelligence work was. She said, making a decision that saves lives in front of you and costs lives you'll never see. She was asked if she thought Operation Barham Night was a success or a failure. She said it was both, and that most operations are. The 7 hostages returned to Israel in March 1994. None of them were told about the surveillance theory. None were informed that their rescue may have provided intelligence that enabled a future attack. Most of them learned about the AMIA bombing from news reports 4 months later and had no reason to connect it to their own abduction. One of them, David Mizrahi, the engineer who had recognized the Arabic phrase, later said in an interview that he never understood why he'd been taken. He said the men who held him didn't ask questions, didn't make demands, just moved him from one location to another and waited. He said it felt less like a kidnapping and more like a rehearsal. Hezbollah never claimed responsibility for the AMIA bombing. Argentine prosecutors issued arrest warrants for several high-ranking Hezbollah officials, but none were ever extradited. In 2006, Argentine and Israeli intelligence agencies concluded jointly that the attack had been ordered by Iran and executed by Hezbollah, with logistical support from Iranian diplomatic personnel in Buenos Aires. Mossad never publicly acknowledged Operation Barham Night. The connection between the March rescue and the July bombing remains officially unconfirmed. But after 1994, Israeli intelligence protocols in South America changed. Response times were shortened, surveillance windows were compressed, and hostage scenarios were treated not just as rescue opportunities, but as potential collection operations designed to study the people responding. The operation saved 7 lives, but what it revealed may have cost dozens more. And the people who made those decisions understood, long before the bomb detonated, that success and failure aren't always separable. If this kind of operational analysis is what you're looking for, there's more waiting on Hidden Ops. Subscribe to see how intelligence work unfolds when the cost of action and the cost of inaction are both unacceptable.